Since the pandemic, housing affordability has shockingly deteriorated across Western nations, with Australia and Canada especially disgraceful. Not only are house prices becoming more and more insane, but rents and cost of living are soaring, making buying a house for a non-homeowner about as easy as pushing a boulder up a mountain. So the big question, if houses keep becoming more and more unaffordable, who's going to be left to buy them? What's the housing endgame? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. A blonde was walking home after some lunchtime drinks and walked into a library. She went up to the librarian and said, "Can I have a Big Mac, large fries and large Coke, please?" "Excuse me," said the librarian. "This is a library." "Oh, sorry," said the blonde. "Can I have a Big Mac, large Coke and large fries, please?" Hey, you might as well like this video and subscribe to my channel. Join our community and together we can consider things from a different perspective than you'll hear from the mainstream media. Today, I'm going to be looking at sections from a video titled, "If No One Can Afford a Home, Who's Gonna Buy Them?" This video was published about a month ago by How Money Works and has been viewed 2 million times. Now, because it focuses on the US housing market, I'm just going to focus on the broad themes and then provide my commentary and some analysis. Let's check it out.
Fewer young people than ever are going to be able to buy a house in their lifetime, and at the same time, homes are getting more expensive every year.
Not just young people, more and more people from all age groups are being locked out of the property market.
But if nobody can afford to buy a house, then how the f do they keep getting more expensive?
Excellent question. House prices have surged since the pandemic in some countries by 30 to 40%. And on top of that, interest rates have also surged. So we've got this double whammy of high prices and high interest rates, making it extremely difficult for many people to buy a property. And yet house prices keep going up and up with no sign it's going to end. So if millions of people can't actually afford a home, how on earth are prices still increasing?
A family home should be the bedrock of your financial life. It gives you somewhere to live while building up equity in a place that you can one day call your own.
This is extremely important for people's financial well-being. When you have a society where housing is affordable, people can buy their own home when they're fairly young, start paying down the mortgage, so when they get a bit older, their repayments will be lower, which will allow them to start saving and investing in other things, which will hopefully then support them during retirement. But when housing becomes so expensive that the average worker can't even afford a home, it sets up a disastrous scenario where people are forced to rent, but instead of a homeowner, when eventually their repayments start reducing, the person forced to rent will continually have to pay higher and higher rent amounts. And if they're never able to buy a home, they could go into retirement with very little savings or investments because more and more of their income was required to pay the higher and higher rental amounts. So the deterioration of housing affordability is actually destroying the financial well-being of millions of people.
Housing affordability is at its lowest point in history. But what's the endgame here? If people can't afford a home, then house prices can't go up anymore, right?
You would think that would be the case, because if you were selling a product and less people could afford to buy that product, you'd normally reduce the price so more people could buy it. But when it comes to property, there's some very powerful and influential players that seem to be determined to keep pushing up property prices and making sure they don't decline too much.
The first reason is that houses do not need to be affordable for you to buy one. If you think that can't make sense, there is an entire industry working to make it true.
I think this is sort of true. In countries like Australia, instead of trying to actually improve housing affordability, they keep coming up with schemes to try and help first home buyers into the market. And some of these schemes might mean that the first home buyer may not need the full 20% deposit. I mean, the latest from the Australian government's called the Family Home Guarantee and states that someone could buy a home sooner for as little as 2% deposit. So there consistently seems to be more and more schemes to get people into the market, but that's designed to get people in who normally couldn't afford to get into the market. And it has the effect of making home prices more and more expensive. In a more freer market, if someone couldn't afford a home, then they just couldn't afford a home. And if enough people couldn't afford a home, property sellers will be forced to reduce the price to where the market could afford. Now, why do countries want property to rise year after year? Well, it's one of the main ways that they stimulate their economy. You see, when you have more debt, people can buy stuff that they previously wouldn't be able to, and you can always borrow the most for property. And when property prices rise, people feel more wealthy. They'll often use that additional equity in their property to loan even more money and maybe buy an investment property or something totally different. Also, increasing house prices helps the entire banking system. You see, countries like Australia and Canada have some of the highest household debt compared to their GDP, and the banks are happy to keep lending more and more because they're confident that property prices will continue rising. And as long as they do rise, they don't really care if a small number of people aren't able to make their repayments, because they'll always be able to sell the property at a strong price. But because of this extreme amount of debt for property, if we did see a real crash of house prices, it would be disastrous for the entire banking system and subsequently the entire economy. So many governments might say they want more affordable housing, but the reality is they need house prices to go up to stimulate their economies and support the entire banking system. But if many non-homeowners can't actually afford a home, who's actually buying?
The first group are all cash buyers that have money from selling their old home and want to buy a new one. If you are a boomer that purchased their home in the 1970s for 3 nickels and you now want to downsize, now is an ideal time to take advantage of the market.
In this category, I'd basically include any property owners who don't have much debt on their properties. This group has been handed the equivalent of the lotto due to pandemic policies putting a rocket under house prices. So because of the massive equity that they have in their property or properties, this group is able to keep buying houses at higher and higher prices.
The second group are people moving interstate. Unaffordable housing is pushing people out of expensive cities across the country. If you move from a city like San Francisco, Seattle, or New York to any other city in the country, you are going to be able to buy a lot more house for the same money.
This is very true, and a great example would be Sydney, Australia, or Toronto, Canada. And here you could have two situations in play. First, you've got non-homeowners in those cities who can't afford to buy there, so they move to a different state to buy where it's cheaper. But secondly, you've got property owners in those cities who can sell their property for massive prices, move to another city and get a lot more bang for their buck and maybe upgrade their house. So this just leads to those cheaper cities becoming more and more expensive, and eventually there are no cheap cities left. In Australia, we've really witnessed this happen in Adelaide and Brisbane, with Brisbane house prices rising about 40% and Adelaide around 50% since the start of the pandemic. So it wasn't enough that Sydney had a basket case of a housing market. Now all the other cities are being destroyed too.
The third group are investors. Investors only care about the return on their assets. Prices are high right now, and investors using financing to buy property are also paying higher interest rates, but in return, they are charging higher rents to long-term tenants and short-term vacationers if they list their properties on sites like Airbnb.
I think investing in property is the national pastime in countries like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And that's because we built a culture of speculating on property only to gain wealth. And why wouldn't you? Government and central bank policies all but guarantee that house prices will continue rising. So there's very little action being taken to discourage investors from continuing to speculate into property. Now there's two other groups that this video didn't mention and particularly applies to Australia. First, we've got foreign investors. The Chinese buy more property in Australia than any other country in the world. And when you've got ultra wealthy people, they don't care if they bid up the prices higher and higher. A lot of foreign investors are looking to park their money in countries where they think property prices will continue rising. And Australia and Canada really take the cake there. Next, we've got wealthy immigrants. You see, Australia and Canada have gone on an immigration bender, and many of those immigrants, due to their skills, already have substantial wealth, especially sometimes with the currency transfers. If you check out this graphic, more millionaires have recently moved to Australia than any other country in the world. And of course, they're going to want to get into this property feeding frenzy. So what's the housing end game? Will the world World Economic Forum's vision that you will own nothing and be happy become a reality. And many people believe that this deterioration in housing affordability is all being done on purpose to somehow lead us towards some great big financial reset. Personally, it's hard to know for sure if it is being done deliberately, but I do find it strange how countries like Australia and Canada, who are currently going through a shocking housing crisis, continue pushing for mass immigration levels far above long-term averages. But back to the housing endgame, if house prices keep outperforming wages consistently year after year, we are going to end up with huge sections of society completely locked out of property ownership. And that means that millions of people will be forced to rent forever, which basically means that they'll be one step away from poverty. And you'll also have this extreme wealth divide because property owners will keep getting richer and richer. And then as those property owners pass on their wealth to their kids, they'll start off with a massive advantage and that wealth will continue. So you could end up with a scenario where you have an upper class and a lower class and nothing much in between. But if this scenario does eventuate, I believe it will lead to massive civil unrest because you could have two people working full-time at the same job where one is extremely rich but the other is just trying to scrape by, and that will create massive tension and resentment. Governments will also have a huge challenge trying to support those without home ownership when they retire. Are they just going to allow millions of people to become homeless because they can't afford to pay the rent that's been increasing year after year? Are people going to be forced into large shared accommodation, hostel style? It's a very bleak picture with massive contrast between property owners and non-property owners. But what if the opposite happens and property prices really start declining? Well, we absolutely could see this scenario in countries like Australia and Canada, especially if interest rates remain high and unemployment rises significantly. And that's because there's so much debt into property. A large increase in unemployment could see a sharp increase in forced property sales, which could feed on itself and send house prices plummeting. Now, because we've mentioned previously, there's so much vested interest in ultra high property prices that this scenario would only occur if governments and central banks have done everything in their power to prop up their market without success. So it's probably the more unlikely scenario at this stage, but considering all the volatility going on in the world right now, countries may not be able to prop up their markets forever. Now, if property prices really did crash by say 30 to 50%, it would be economic calamity. There is so much wealth tied up in property that if people saw their wealth just start to evaporate, consumer spending would plummet, companies would be forced to do mass layoffs, so unemployment levels would surge, and then would see a recession/depression scenario. So in this scenario, nearly everyone gets smashed. So those are the extremes of the housing endgame, and at this stage, it's hard to know exactly how it's going to play out, especially if there is a hidden agenda trying to lead the world into a situation where they can perform a great financial reset. But either way, it's going to be a very bumpy ride. I'm Biko Konstantinos.